The audit planning. The first stage of the audit process is audit planning. The first general accepted auditing standard of field work requires adequate planning. Why an audit planning is essential? First, it enables the auditor to obtain sufficient evidence. It keeps audit costs reasonable. It avoids misunderstanding with the client. And finally, to maintain a good reputation in the business community. What are the benefits derived from planning audits? There are a number of primary benefits from planning audits. First, it helps the auditor to obtain sufficient evidence, and obtaining sufficient evidence will lead to minimize the CPA firm's legal liability. Number two, it helps to keep the audit costs reasonable. Number three, it helps to avoid misunderstandings with the client. Number four, to facilitate high quality work. Number five, to help the CPA firm remain competitive. Number six, to maintain a good reputation in the business community. Now we will identify the major steps in planning audits. The major steps in planning audits are as follows. Number one, assess acceptable audit risk and inherent risk. Number two, accept the client and perform initial planning. Number three, understand the client's business and industry. Number four, assess the client's business risk. Number five, perform introductory analytical procedures. The first step, assess acceptable audit risk and inherent risk. Assessing the acceptable audit risk and inherent risk is an important part of audit planning because it helps to determine the following. Number one, the amount of evidence that will be needed to be accumulated. Number two, the experience level of staff assigned to the engagement. Number three, the cost of the audit process. Audit risks include acceptable risk and inherent risk. The acceptable risk is a measure of how willing the auditor is to accept that the financial statements may be materially misstated after the audit is completed and unqualified audit report has been issued. For example, on a lower acceptable risk, the auditor decides that he wants to be more certain that the financial statements are not materially misstated. Therefore, they will accumulate more evidence, and hence the audit cost or the audit fees will be higher. Zero risk is certainty, and 100% risk is complete uncertainty. The second audit risk is inherent risk. The inherent risk is a risk posed by an error or omission in the financial statements due to a factor other than a failure of internal control. So the misstatement in the financial statement is due to a factor other than a failure of the internal control. The inherent risk level is relatively high when transactions are complex, when a high degree of judgment is required in regard to the financial estimates, and the inherent risk level is relatively high for specific industries. For example, merchandising companies, in which the inherent risk will be high for the inventory accounts. When the level of inherent risk is high, the auditor should take steps to improve the audit procedures. For example, increase the sample size, and hence the evidence accumulated will be increased. So the audit cost or the audit fee required by the auditor will be higher. The second step of audit planning is to accept client and perform initial audit planning. In this stage, the auditor will decide first whether to accept a new client or continue serving an existing one. Number 2, identify the client's reasons for an audit. The auditor here will identify why the client wants or needs an audit. Number 3, obtain an understanding with the client. The auditor obtains an understanding with the client about terms of the engagement. Number 4, develop overall audit strategy. The auditor here develops an overall strategy for the audit, including the engagement staffing and audit specialists. In client acceptance, why a CPA firm must use care in deciding which clients are acceptable. Because of first, legal responsibility. The auditor has legal and professional responsibilities not to accept the clients who lack integrity. Number 2, problems and fees. Fees can cause more problems than they are worth. Number 3, high risk industries. Some CPA firms now refuse any clients in certain high risk industries, such as software technology companies and insurance companies, and may even discontinue auditing existing companies in those industries. When it comes to a new client, before accepting a new client, the auditor will investigate the following. Number 1, the CPA industry knowledge. Number 2, the client's standing in the business community. Number 3, the financial stability. Number 4, relations with its previous CPA firm. How the auditor obtained information about the new client, or what are the sources of information about the new client. New auditor is required by auditing standards to communicate with the predecessor auditor or the previous auditor who audits this client before the new auditor, to help him whether to accept the engagement or not. Number 2, gathering information from local lawyers, other CPAs, banks, and other businesses. Number 3, or the third source of information, is to hire a professional investigator to obtain information about the reputation and the background of the key members of the management. Many CPAs evaluate existing clients annually to determine whether there are reasons for not continuing to do an audit, such as previous conflicts over the appropriate scope of the audit. Number 2, the type of the opinion to issue. Number 3, unpaid fees. Number 4, the client lacks integrity. So all of these reasons can make the auditor to discontinue the audit. After accepting the client, the auditor should identify the client's reasons for audit. Throughout the engagement, the auditor may get additional information about why the client is having an audit and the likely uses and users of the financial statements. First, the auditor has to accumulate more evidence when the statements are to be used extensively, such as public held companies and companies that are to be sold in the near future. The most likely uses of the financial statements can be determined from previous experience with the client and discussions with the management. Obtain an understanding with the client. The auditing standards require that the auditors document their understanding with the client in an engagement letter. And this engagement letter will include the following. Number 1, the engagement objectives. Number 2, the responsibility of the auditor and the management. Number 3, identification of financial reporting framework used by the board of directors. Number 4, reference to the expected form and content of the audit report. Number 5, the engagement limitations. Number 6, an agreement to provide other service such as tax returns, or management consulting. Number 7. An agreement on fees. Then the auditor will develop the overall audit strategy. First, selecting staff for engagement. The underlying principle in the auditing standards requires that auditor is responsible to select competent and qualified staff for the engagement. The assigned staff must be knowledgeable about the client's industry. The auditor considers the nature of the client's business and industry, including the areas where there is greater risk of significant misstatements, in order to determine resources required for the engagement, including the engagement staff. The auditor should also determine if he will need to rely on the opinion of outside specialists, such as specialists in certain technical areas or statistical sampling. The auditor should have sufficient understanding of the client's business to recognize whether there is a need for specialists. So, in order to determine whether the auditor needs a specialist or not, he should first have sufficient understanding of the client's business. If the audit requires specialized knowledge, it may be necessary to consult a specialist. The auditor's responsibilities when depending on a specialist will be as follows. The auditing standards requires that auditor can select specialist and review his work. Auditor must evaluate specialist qualifications. The audit report shouldn't refer to the specialist unless the specialist's report results in a departure from unqualified report, which means modification of the audit report.